Around 16 months ago, I moved to a different city to do my theological studies. And I had around 4 months before school started when I first came here. And so I started listening to a lot of podcasts. And one of my favorite podcasters kept mentioning this specific book called The Resurrection of Jesus by Dale Allison. Of course, for me, the resurrection of Jesus, whether it happened, is the biggest mystery to mankind and continues to be. And so, of course, this book captured my attention from the first time that I heard about it. And the book was written by someone called Dale Allison. And I actually knew Dale Allison beforehand. And if you're familiar with the Christian academic world, you'll also probably have heard about him. He's an evangelical Christian. So I was kind of skeptical in terms of reading the book because I had no interest in reading sort of an apologetical defense of Christianity. I wanted something that was completely objective. And as time went on and I heard more and more about this book, it was clear that it was something that I had to read because it was not an apologetical, hardcore defense of Christianity. No, it was apparently one of the best sort of works when it comes to understanding and when it comes to being completely objective about what we can really know about the resurrection events of Jesus. And so I went on the internet and I bought the book. It sat on my shelf for a couple of months before I actually read it. And now I've read it and I want to share my thoughts with you guys. Now, before I get into the book itself, I do have a couple of things I want to say. Now, at least in my university, the students of theology are not programmed, but they are incited, at least, not to care so much for the historical authenticity when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason I say this is because the students sort of have to read the works of Kierkegaard, and more specifically, a work called Philosophical Fragments, wherein Kierkegaard criticizes the Christian need and the very human need to know for certain what really happened back then. And so Kierkegaard criticizes this instinct in humans. But I've always looked at this in a different way. I think the core claim of Christianity is a historical claim on par with other historical claims, and such claims can be investigated and we can critically analyze these claims, and that's what has really interested me since many years. And I also think that if Kierkegaard was here today, he would have a different view on this, because back then in Kierkegaard's time, the quest for the historical Jesus, where we take all of the theological things out of the Gospels and try to establish what we can truly say about the historical person known as Jesus of Nazareth, it was not really a thing back then. And so such a quest would be much more speculative in its conclusions than it would have been today. And everything that you could have said about Jesus back then, historically, back then in Kierkegaard's time, it would have been much more speculative and much more maybe than today. But when you read the book, don't expect to, when you're done, don't expect to be able to come out and say to your friends, now I know that this happened, or now I know that this didn't happen. Of course, it's not going to be like that, because there is no conclusion. If there is a conclusion to the book, it is that the evidence is good enough for the Christians to believe, yet it's also bad enough for the skeptics to disbelieve. And I think not a lot of people acknowledge this fact. It's very rarely acknowledged. And there is a great quote in the preface of the book where Dale actually writes, "The conclusion of the book is not lurking in the foundations of the inquiry." So he's not led by the conclusions, he's led to the conclusions. And too often this is not the case. But in terms of the book itself, we're introduced to the sources that we actually have of the resurrection of Jesus. And of course, most people are going to know at least some of them. You have the four Gospels, of course. You have Mark being the first one, John being the last one. You also have the apocryphal texts, which are sort of biblical texts that were not really included in the biblical tradition anyway, but of course some of them still say things about the historical, about Jesus, or claim things about Jesus, and so they're also included in the book. And if you know Greek, if you know ancient Greek, you're in for a treat here, because he includes the original sources in the book. Now, personally, I myself, I have not had lessons in ancient Greek yet. it's due to, I'm gonna have it later this year, and so I'm very excited for that. So I'm gonna have to reread the book at some point. But of course, Allison is able to establish, I think at least with some degree of certainty, that of course there are a lot of theological points in the Gospels. You know, things that probably didn't happen, but he's also able to establish that many of the things that the Gospel writers are writing, they're actually writing from legitimate memory. And one of the best examples we can establish of this is that they include certain things that actually seems to hurt the narrative. And so if they were just writing to make up a great story or something like that, they wouldn't have included these things. And one of the best examples of this is probably the fact that it happens to be women who see the resurrected Jesus first. Now, of course, in first century Palestine, the eyewitness testimony of a woman was not really reliable in the eyes of others. And then you also have the fact that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council, apparently was the first person to actually take the body of Christ and then bury him. And there would be no reason to include these facts in the story. So here you at least have some legitimate memory that they're writing for. And we also have, in my opinion, we are introduced to the sources of Paul. Now, the letters of Paul make up most of the New Testament, actually. I think it's something like half of the New Testament, and he's the absolute earliest source. But in terms of a historical source, he's quite poor, because he makes a lot of incredible claims, but he never elaborates on the claims themselves. And it's really a shame. And Allison never fails to mention this. He mentions this a lot of times. An example of this, at one point, he mentions that 500 people saw the risen Jesus at first. Now, this is often used by apologetics because it is an incredible claim. Now, Paul is not here, is probably not lying. That's not the idea that we have of Paul. It's not the idea that I have of Paul or that Allison has of Paul. But he doesn't elaborate. Now, there's so many questions to be asked here. Did they all see the same thing? Now, why would they gather? Because 500 people being gathered in first century Palestine would be extremely strange. Now, if we were there and interviewed everyone individually, would they all claim to have seen the exact same thing? How did they even know how did they even know what Jesus looked like? And again, if you know Greek, you're also going to be able to sort of follow Ellison's argument, because there is an argument to be made that the Greek word used for 500 actually doesn't mean 500 or something like that, but I don't really know about that because I don't know Greek. Now, Paul, of course, also has his own experience with the resurrected Jesus, but he never actually mentions this. Now, there is a bit of a contrast between Paul's own letters and then the Paul that we're introduced to in Acts, the Acts of the Apostles book in the Bible. But yeah. We also introduced to the empty tomb and then the resurrection. And it's very important that we separate these two, because Allison claims that the fact that the disciples or the apostles claimed to find the tomb in which Jesus was buried to be empty is probably something that happened historically. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Jesus resurrected. We have to separate these things. It would probably be very likely for this to have happened. It was common for people to steal bodies back then. It could have been the Jewish authorities who took Jesus away. It could have been the disciples themselves who took Jesus away in order to establish sort of a strong foundation for this new religion. There's also the question of whether or not the disciples were sort of predisposed to believe in the resurrection because of the eschatological expectations of Christ himself. And if Christ had eschatological expectations, then his disciples also had them for sure. Now, the Christian tradition, Allison claims this, is not alone when it comes to making claims such as an empty tomb and seeing a dead person or something like that. If you're a Christian and you deem the evidence for Christianity to be strong, then I think you reach some problems if you apply that logic to other areas of human history, because you can also find monks in Nepal, for example, or in India who claim something called rainbow body, and there's actually good evidence for this. It's very strange that monks, if they live a very virtuous life, they apparently their body disappears right after they die, and this is strange. Now, the Christian tradition is alone when it comes to the combination of these things. They're not alone in saying that this dead person of Jesus, his body disappeared. They're not alone in that, but they are alone when it comes to saying that he died, that people claim to have seen him, that we have the sources for it, and so on and so on. They're alone in that. Mm. Now, how we interpret these data, for example, how we interpret the Gospels and how we interpret Paul's letters, is dependent on our worldview. Now, a Western person, someone living in the Western world and the Western worldview, we're of course going to be predisposed to think that this type of stuff doesn't really happen. If you ask a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian, they're going to have a different take on the evidence. If someone has had a supernatural experience prior to this, prior in their life, they're going to be predisposed to think that this is probably very likely. There's also a lot of stuff going on subconsciously that plays a part in how we judge the data set. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as being able to objectively judge data, but there's no such thing as objectivity if we're actually being completely honest with ourselves. Now, I just can't stress enough how incredibly relieving it was for me to read this book, because there's no such thing as a non-biased person. It's not possible. It's sort of human nature to be biased. But we come very close with Allison. He makes a great case for the skeptics, a very good case, and he makes a great case for the Christians. He doesn't hide the fact that he's a Christian himself. He doesn't at all, but it doesn't shine through too strongly in his arguments and so on. So that's very liberating. I think the skeptics will be very disappointed and surprised if they go into this with an open mind. And at the same time, I think the hardcore Christians will also be very disappointed and probably feel a little attacked, because they're going to be able to see that the arguments from the skeptics are actually pretty good if they're being completely honest with themselves. So I recommend that you buy this very awesome book if you're able to go into it with an open mind. You know, too often I see people blocking out the things that they don't agree with before they go into something that they inquire, and it's such a shame. So if you're able to go into this with the openness of seeing the other side, with the willingness to do that, then I recommend that you buy the book. Now, it's a quite expensive book. I think I paid like 50 euros or something like that. But it's fine, I guess. I think Allison spent decades writing this book, and that really shows when you read it. Great book. I recommend you to read it. Yeah, if you can do what I just said. So thank you guys for watching.